also want to do it efficiently as well. Great. We'll talk a bit about pay at the end, and then we'll hopefully have time to mop up a lot of your themes that you put in the Padlet or your questions at that stage. Okay, let's before we move on, let's just have a quick look at Padlet to see the sorts of things people have been talking about. So people are hoping to increase efficiency. Yes, absolutely. Like we just said there. Refresher, thinking about ChatGPT. Yeah, we'll talk about artificial intelligence later on. Sharing best practice. Great. That's exactly what we're trying to do, isn't it? Okay. How do we, what do we find difficult? Yes. Avoiding marking too harshly. Getting started. Yes. Procrastination. Yes, we're going to touch on a lot of these things. So that's great. But do keep those coming in as we're talking. That would be great. But for the moment, I'm going to hand over to Ralf, who's going to start us off. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Chris. So I'm going to share my screen now. So can you please, switch off your microphone in the meantime? I need to, here's my screen. So what I want to start out with is just because many of you will be not from the UK, will be new to this sort of higher education environment. I want to give you a little bit of an idea of how the marking process, what you do, how that sits in a bigger picture, and what that means, what the outcome of your marking, what sort of consequence that has. So firstly, you need to understand, and this is very good to keep in mind, especially when students come and sort of try and challenge you, oh, why did I not do this? The marking process is not only you. It's a big process, right? And if you're like a teacher, you know, what you need to understand is that it's your course convener who has written the questions, or course director, however you call it. But it's not even your course director who does who sets the assessments by him or herself alone. There will be an internal moderator or internal examiner, a colleague in the department who looks at an assessment. Then there will be an external examiner, and the same in the marking process. So you will mark. And then your course convener will, you know, especially if there are several TAs, and we get to that point a little later, your course convener has responsibility for making sure that your marking is okay. Okay, you're not the last line of sort of defense or the only one responsible. It's your course director or course convener who's responsible. And then there will be someone who will, inside the department, will sort of double check, will do some sort of second marking type stuff. And then there will be an external examiner, a colleague with expertise in your area from another university who will look at a sample of scripts. And then there will be an exam board which will come to a judgment whether the entire grade distribution is appropriate. Right? So you are super important, but only one piece in the entire process. Okay, so that hopefully gives you a little bit of, well, we say that to take a little bit of the burden off your shoulders and, you know, say, okay, that there is an entire process behind here. Now, here in the UK, we have this sort of, we have a scale, usually most universities, not them, there are exceptions. Most universities grade on a scale between 0 and 100. But really what we are doing is a sort of category, we have grade categories at the higher level. First class, upper second class, lower second class, third class, and then fail degrees on undergrad degrees this is. And you can see what on a 0 to 100 scales, what grades are associated with that. Everything above 70 is a first. Now, the reason why this is important is because the overall grade outcome for a student's degree will be classified according to these classes. So a student will get a first class degree or an upper second class degree. And the category outcome is potentially very important either for MSc admissions. Many MSc programs will say, hey, you have to have at least a 2.2 or at least a 2.1. But also for some jobs, this degree category is very important. Now, what do these categories mean? They're represented by these numbers, but it's quite important that you don't think about everything is a first class where students answer 70% or more correct. It's very important to not think about these numbers as a percentage. These are sort of qualitative categories, and we, you know, capture In the end, there are grades, numbers, which then tell us what category it is. But when we set exams, we have to think about these categories. And you can see there are sort of different universities have sort of different marking criteria or assessment criteria. You should make yourself familiar with the ones at your university, but I suspect they will look fairly similar. And you can see sometimes these sort of keywords, quality keywords in Manchester, for instance, you know, upper second class grades are very good grades. So any piece of assessment that is above 60, we rate as very good. And that's sometimes very difficult to communicate to students. They think very good, surely that's got to be 80 or 90 or higher. So that's something that especially we need to communicate to students, not only you, your course convener, your course director, but you may have a little role in this. Sometimes for individual assessments, you will find very clear marking criteria. So we'll get to that later, okay? But sometimes for individual assessments, you find these high-level criteria translated into particular aspects for an argument, for instance, how literature is used, arguments, how the question is answered, how the structure of the essay, for instance. We're not going to go through this in detail. In the last thing in this section I want to say is that as far as I'm aware, very few universities sort of grade or ask the marking staff to grade to a distribution. So there's very few universities which would say, hey, 15% have to get a first and 30% have to get a 2-1 and so forth. But in most universities, they will have some sort of view of what an appropriate distribution is. And that's an appropriate distribution can be a wide range. It's possibly better to think about it. What is a distribution where a department will say, hey, something isn't quite right here? Okay, so in Manchester, for instance, and there may be slightly different, there will be slight variations to this in other places. Distributions for a particular course unit where the average grade is, say, outside the 58 to 65 range, sometimes are looked at. Okay, that doesn't necessarily mean that then something changes. There may be very good reasons for this, but this is sort of the typical range of average grades. Distributions, courses where more than 20% of students fail are typically looked at. And someone will at least ask the course director, hey, why is that? Do you understand why that is so? Perhaps there's an explanation, but perhaps not. Distributions, especially for bigger sort of classes where fewer than 10% get firsts. Questions will most likely be asked. However, also if there are perhaps more than 30% firsts, we possibly don't expect many units where that happens, or distributions where there's too little spread in the distribution, where almost everyone gets either a 2-1 or a 2-2. That possibly indicates that we are not making the right use of the range of grades we have available. So why does your marking matter? So hopefully that gave you a little bit of an idea of sort of the environment we are marking in, okay, what sort of typical marking distributions are. Now, why does it matter? So for your students, let's start with this. The degree class they get, and that will be a function of individual grades for individual units, will open or close doors. That's important to understand. So for instance, and of course, students are mainly responsible for that, how they work and what they produce. Here, for instance, if you look, Pride Network is for like summer internship opportunities. And if you look at many of the, especially the more desirable type of internships, you will see that there are sort of grade requirements. Okay, students would be studying towards a 2-1 or higher class in their degree. So if they have a third in first year courses, then they may not get onto these types of internships. Okay, and then finally, once they have a final degree class, that again does open opportunities if they have a good opportunity, if they have a good degree, or may close it if they don't have it. You should, of course, also think about them whenever you grade, and your marking is feedback opportunity. We talk about that later. Now, for your course convener, why does it matter for your course convener and for you and for your department that your marking is of high quality. And what we mean with that later, well, it is basically because your course convener or course director doesn't want to do your job again. If he or she figures out that you haven't done what she or he wanted you to do, then someone's got to do the job again. They don't want to do it. You don't want to do that again. We also want students to understand their grades, because otherwise they'll be knocking at your door, your course director's door. We're happy for that, for additional feedback, okay, if students want to learn how to be better, but we don't want to have conversations about having to justify grades, okay? And finally, I showed you earlier this process of marking, which involves internal and external moderators. Your marking and how you mark will make the job of the internal and external moderators easier. You want to make sure that they can understand why you have given certain grades. And the final thing here is, whenever you mark, please assume that students will see your markups and your comments. So please, make any markups sort of constructive and not personal. So this is as much as I had to say. So I'm going to pass to Annika.
Thanks, Ralf. Okay. I should have the slides now, but shout if you can't see everything. Okay, so I just want to give a bit of an overview, I guess, of what's going on in the general marking process in a unit module. And this is going to help give us context before Chris, and then I'll come back again later, we get into kind of the real detail of it and how to do it all. So I think the first thing is to talk a little bit here just about expectations, because to me this is kind of key to the whole thing. Just as you might like try to set up good expectations in your classroom of what's going to happen, you kind of need to set up clear expectations at the start of your marking process. Okay, Ralf just mentioned, there are these kind of distributions we might expect or might be out of line, but we should also think about in general, what is it we should be aiming for in a unit. I think one of the discussions I most often have with new colleagues, particularly when they've come from the US, is that we don't grade to a curve in most institutions, right? We have these distributions that should be sort of aligned with the marking criteria rather than looking for this perfectly shaped normal distribution. And that's kind of what we'd be expecting. But just as well as the marks that you might be expecting, you also kind of need to align your expectations on what feedback you're expected to give, what comments you're expected to give, and how you are expected to give those. So my screen has become messy. Here we go. Kind of consistency is the key, and I was really pleased to see that on the Padlet somebody wrote, one of the things I want to understand is how to achieve consistency. And there's kind of consistency within your own stuff, and there's consistency across the different pieces of marking as well. So really the very first thing you're going to need before you start to think about how you're going to mark or how anyone else does any marking is have you got what you need to create that consistency? And that's going to start with some kind of written guidance. I would suggest that this is actually a marking guide, not just a list of solutions that you're looking for. You're not just looking for what is the answer to the question, you're looking for how do I reward the answers that have been written down, what gives marks and at which level. So typically for my courses and any TAs I'm working with, I would be looking to give them a marking guide that says, if you see this, this is the kind of level of mark you're looking for. Or if you see this, this requires 3 marks in a reward. But even if you have that, even if you have a module lead who's put a lot of time and thought into that, you might not end up with consistency. And that's because everybody might interpret things differently, right? So there's this piece of research we often like to show. Looking here at, you can see each row of this table is a different grader who's all marking the same thing. So there's grade marker 1, marking SA-A, marker SA-B, and so on. And you can see the different classifications, these same pieces of work were given by all these different markers, and experience markers as well. And we still get a range in the types of marks people might give. So just having a marking guide isn't enough. You need to somehow do your best to try and get on the same page. And that's where you need some kind of vehicle to help you achieve intermarker consistency. So at Bristol, I would call this a benchmarking process. Okay, there should be some kind of point at which we get together as a group who teach on the model and who's marking, where somebody explains or leads a meeting and we say, what mark do we think this deserves? And then we would talk about, should it be this end of the band or lower end of the band? Should this type of thing get reward in terms of marks? And simply by talking it through, by getting together, we all start to understand what it is we're all going to be giving marks for or not. This kind of allows you as a team to keep producing more consistent marks than you might otherwise. Typical benchmarking process would start with getting a sample of the total scripts to be marked. You sit round, you discuss those, you've probably marked them all individually, you agree on some marks, and then you could go away and start your marking once the team is all on the same page. Even then, it might involve something, I would call it early moderation, other places might call it interim moderation, where you maybe stop after the first 10 or so scripts that you've marked and check that you are all still marking consistently and whether you need to change anything before you go and mark the next 100 scripts or so, because it is so much more painful to change marks at the end of the process than at the start. So that's kind of in general, I think, what you should be expecting to have to start marking, right? So before we get to talking about even how to start marking, these are kind of some of the basics you're going to need. You're going to need to know what you're rewarding, so you need some kind of solutions and marking guide, and you need some kind of ability to get on the same page as the other people who are marking so that it sets you all in the right direction. Are we taking a brief pause here, Chris?
If that's the end of your section, then
it is indeed.
That's right. Thank you, Annika. Okay, that sets the scene very nicely. So thanks for that, Ralf and Annika. As Annika said, we're going to talk more about the practicalities next. But before we do that, let's just pause for any questions that people might have on the material so far, either by entering into the chat or into the Padlet, if that's easier for you. Probably the chat's better if you can, or indeed put your hand up if you want to speak, even better. But let's have some questions now, if anyone's got any.
And perhaps I'll ask Annika a question, if that's okay, Chris.
Yes, please go ahead.
Yeah, Annika, if you're involved on like on a course where you're not the course director, but you're contributing to the marking, and the course director does not call such a process, a benchmarking process, what do you advise to do?
First of all, what I would do is unmute myself. I think, you know, there are different reasons that can happen. And I think, first of all, the most sensible thing is go speak to the person or drop an email that says, hi, I'm marking this, just checking how we're going about benchmarking. Is there a time we should meet to do this? Are there sample scripts to mark? And I would take it from there. You know, people get busy. I don't know. I understand that, because I remember when I first started doing this, it can be like quite difficult, particularly if you're a very new, for example, PhD student to marking, and you're dealing with some big scary unit directors that some departments have. It can be a bit intimidating, but you know, this is actually in everybody's favour. This will make the process better in the long run. You want to avoid things like student complaints. Student complaints are really costly and take up everybody's time. You want to avoid students actually being unnecessarily upset. So giving people every opportunity to sort of start the process in the best way is the right thing to do, and that is why you would be right to go and ask the questions and right to ask the email. Right to send the email, I mean. Does that sound fair, Ralf? Excellent.
You might be on mute, Ralf, I wonder.
Oh, yeah. No, absolutely, Annika. So I can only just support your message. Please do go to the convener. Sometimes the convener may have just forgotten, and will be very grateful for your reminder to set this up.
Other times, I think when I felt more nervous about it, I know you guys will find it hard to believe there was a time at which I was nervous about things, but there we go. I've got together with the other people who are also marking on the unit as well, and just, sort of sent a group thing.
Yeah. No, that's a very good point. Actually, there's something, and I'm sure this will come up very soon later again. If you are several people on a course marking, please make use of this. Spend whatever, perhaps rent a room where you can do marking together. If it's physical scripts, even if it's not physical scripts, with your laptops, you're not alone in this. And sort of, I think none of us here will say that the marking time is one of the best times of your year. It's possibly, we all think it's the opposite. It's one of the least enjoyable parts of the job. But if you share that with other people, it just becomes a little bit easier.
Any more questions? Okay, I think a lot of us want to hear about how to actually do it. So I'm going to move on to that now, and we'll come back for questions right at the end, where you can come back to this or the topics later on. Okay, so I'm going to share my screen now, if that's okay, Annika. Very good. Okay, so I'm imagining now we're at the point where you've been left with the scripts. Hopefully you've gone through that benchmarking process that we've just talked about. But you're now on your own, or in your room with your fellow markers, as Ralf said. What do we do? What do we do next? Okay, I'm going to talk about 4 issues. I'm going to think about what to do when you're setting up, the approach that you're going to take when you start marking, what to write on the script when you're marking, and how much to check when you think you've done marking. Okay, all hopefully very, very practical. So setting up, what are the essential ingredients that you're going to need? Obviously, you're going to need the scripts themselves. Probably you've got a few hundred too many for your liking, but you're going to have your big scripts. You're going to have a marking criteria or some kind of rubric, some kind of guidance, as we've been saying. Hopefully the module leader, course leader, unit leader, whoever has given you instructions, has given you some kind of rubric to help you identify the different categories and gradings. Hopefully you've gone through a benchmarking process where if at the very least some past examples from previous years have been issued to help you get a gauge on the level. And then finally, and I'm going to make a big deal about this, is the marking spreadsheet where you're going to record the marks. Either this could be some kind of shared document through a Google Doc or something like that, live, or everyone's going to have their own copy and then they'll get merged by the module leader at the end, perhaps. Now, this marking spreadsheet is super important. I'm going to show you an example of one in a moment. But let me say what they're not for, first of all. Okay, a lot of people, unfortunately, just think this is an end phase of the marking. They mark the scripts, they keep everything on the script. It's all physical. There's no computer use at all. They whiz through their scripts. And then at the end, they realize that admin require the scripts, the marks, to be submitted on a spreadsheet. So therefore, they go through all their physical scripts and they translate the marks from the scripts onto the spreadsheet at the end and say, here, admin, here you go. Okay, that is missing the point a lot. This marking spreadsheet, yes, it has to record the marks for that purpose, but it's so much more than that too. Okay, by doing it as you go along instead of at the end, it gives you lots of benefits. For example, as you go through, it will help you keep an eye on how your average is going. Obviously at the start, it's when you're trying to find out what the level is, it's difficult. Then keeping a gauge on whether you keep that standard or whether you change that standard as you progress. By day 5, are you marking in the same way that you marked on day 1? This can tell you by completing this spreadsheet as you go along. Also, I think the spreadsheet builds in a natural kind of checking for you. You can see, oh, so that student hasn't got a mark for question 2. Did I miss that? Did they not answer it? Here, it just highlights that and helps you to pick out those errors very easily. Okay. I'm going to show you an example now, just a mock one that I've made up here. As you can see, we've got the ID numbers here. This is what the module leader will perhaps provide you with. Okay, and then we've got the different questions here that are being marked in some way. And I'm going to just quickly go through some various features of this mark sheet that are useful. Firstly, I really like to ensure that this order of students is the same order as the order of scripts that I've got physically. By synchronizing the order in that way, I can then, once I've started marking, I can just move on to the next one and work my way down here, knowing that it corresponds to the scripts. Okay. Without that, I'm going to have to be checking the ID numbers all the time, which is very difficult, prone to mistakes, and it just helps things along. So I spend a bit of time at the start making sure that the orders are the same. To do that depends on your university, but some universities have desk numbers as well as the ID numbers on the scripts, and these are often a lot easier to handle rather than these complicated numbers here. So looking for desk number 19 is a bit of easier identifier than this number here. Here are these averages and counts here that are useful. As I said, when you're progressing through your marking, I'm keeping an eye on these averages to see how they're behaving from day to day, from hour to hour, to see whether I'm being consistent with myself, being intra-marker consistent with myself. Okay. Also, some people might like to do something like this, where they can look at the distribution and think, well, how many 2-1s have I got in my distribution, going back to what Ralf was saying and that curve, just to keep a track on that as well. Finally, sometimes if you can't synchronize the order of the scripts, or if you need to find a particular student, then this find function in Excel is really useful. Okay, so if I'm looking for a particular row, let's say 073521, I can just put this in here like this, and it's just going to pick out the row automatically. If you've got hundreds of students, then that's really good and far more accurate than working your way through, even if these in the right order. There's some that are very similar to that, and so I'm going to make a mistake. This ensures that it's quick and foolproof. Okay, so that's really important, that spreadsheet.
Chris, can I ask you a question at this stage?
Yes.
You in your narrative, you were thinking, or it sounded like you were thinking of physical scripts. But you do this as well for online marking when you have?
Yes, apologies. Yes, of course, if you're online marking, then you won't have a physical order of scripts. Of course, you just have a bunch of files, won't you, as well? In that case, this find function is even more important. So you'll pick a file out, and then you'll have to correspond that to the same row, or vice versa. So yeah, thanks, Ralf. I was going into auto physical scripts there, but this would serve both purposes. That's right. Thank you. Okay, that was setting up. 2, I'm thinking about approach now. So again, this is really important. Often people just dive in without thinking about their approach. And there's 3 different sort of approaches that people either implicitly or explicitly take when they're marking. First one is they mark by question. This is the way I prefer to mark if I can. Okay, this is saying, right, I'm going to mark anyone who's answered question 1. Please keep your microphone off if you can. Thank you. I'm going to mark by question. I'm going to mark everyone who's answered question 1, I'm going to do first. And I'm not going to worry about any of the other questions. I'm just focusing on that. This is brilliant because my poor brain can't really cope with more than that. I just have to remember how to mark question 1 at any one point. Okay, it's quick, easy, accurate, helps me be consistent, better. Okay, but that does mean that I'm changing between scripts more often, and that's costly. And also, if I'm swapping scripts, if somebody else is marking question 4, then I might have to swap scripts with them in some way. And especially if they're physical scripts, I might have to go into university. They might, it's costly there. But apart from that, this is much easier. Alternatively, people mark by script and then go through an entire script. They mark question 1, question 2, question 3, question 4, whatever, before moving on to the next script. There, you have to remember everything, how to mark all the questions in your head at the same time. I find that very difficult, but that is maybe better, more practical if some of these costs are very large because you're not switching between scripts so frequently. Alternatively, you might do a hybrid version of that. So it might be that if you're marking a very hard question that is hard to sort of think about, maybe I'll do that by question, but the rest are easy. I can remember them, I can mark them quickly. I'll do that by script. What I'm saying here is whatever you do, these are going to be different, best in different circumstances for different people. Whatever you do, just have a plan and think about it carefully, think about it strategically, carefully. And that will depend on how experienced you are, maybe what level the students are, whether it's an offline or online exam like we were just talking about. That these will all just change the pros and cons of these different approaches, but certainly have a think about this, have a plan. Now, people often ask, oh, how much should I write on the scripts? And that's a difficult question, and it will vary by your institution. Your module leader might give you specific instructions about this, but here are some general thoughts and principles. In terms of the actual marks, often some especially technical questions will have sub-questions, parts to them, question 1, part A, part B, part C. Generally, most people mark in the margin of the script, so that's a bit of a convention that most people do that in the margin. And then when you've done the sub-questions, there'll be a total mark for that question if we add up A, B, C, and D for question 1. It's often useful to annotate those in different ways. So me personally, again, you can do it in different ways, but I would put a sub-question in a mark in a circle. So 1A would have a circle, whereas at the end of question 1 in a box, I'd put the total for question 1. And that's just very convenient when people are checking numbers at the end to see what the different bits mean. Once you've done that, of course, you have to often put the question marks on the front of the script as well. I'll give you a quick example of that here. This is an online exam from COVID period, which is maybe not ideal for us today, but it serves a purpose. Here is a technical question that has lots of parts, and you can see this part A for question 2 here, I've put in the margin and I've put it in a circle. That is a part mark. And as we go through, you will see different parts for this question 2. And then at the end of question 2, I've summed up all those components and put it in a box here to indicate, right, this is a question score now, a question mark as the sum of those parts. For an essay, yeah, please.
Oh, sorry, I was just going to point out the other great thing you're doing here is you're doing it in a different color, right? Maybe easy because this is a scanned one, but even if you're marking actual exam scripts, pick a different color to what the student's written in.
Yeah, great point. Great point, Annika. Yeah, that can be difficult, especially when people start marking away from the margin. It's sometimes very difficult to pick out. So if you use a different color and if you try and keep to the margin where you can, then that would be better. Good. Thanks, Annika. If you're marking an essay, you won't have these part marks. And so just at the end there, I just give a mark for that essay or that written question. Finally, what about, that's how to put the marks on the script. What about the comments? So comments are important for several reasons. We do need to put some comments on. Why? Well, it helps the sort of checking process. Why did they give that? Why did my colleague do that? Oh, they've written a small justification there. So that's useful. But also then once the exam marks are released, some universities allow students to see the scripts. Some universities allow students to ask for sort of reports of their marks. And for that, you may need to go back, or your module leader might need to go back to the script and remember, why on earth did I give this 20? Or why on earth did I give this 14? And for that, then, I would write a small 1 or 2 sentences, especially with written answers that are very difficult to sort of remember why I did. I would give a small justification. So here I've said, well, they had some nice own thoughts, lack some details on the basics or whatever, just enough for me to say something. Then if the student did request a bit more information, I could remember quickly why I did this. Okay.
Chris,
go on.
Sorry, I was going to ask you a question. Is there anything you wouldn't write in those small comments?
Yes, well, that would depend, wouldn't it? So at Loughborough, the students don't see the scripts, and so there's no risk of me being too maybe critical or too offensive in any way. Obviously, we don't want to be too offensive anyway, but I'd know that. Other universities, if the students are seeing this, obviously you're going to have to word things a little bit more carefully, perhaps. Would you have any experience from your side on that, Annika?
So our students absolutely can see the script, and I'm always particularly aware of like if it's particularly a bad mark. And I think students could often be, even perceive like thirds as fails and things like that. So we have a policy on my units where if it's particularly bad, you might also add a comment about where to go to follow up and improve for next time, and where to sort of what the next step would be if they want to speak to somebody more about it. So often have those things in mind as well, because they can read the scripts.
Yeah, great. And so definitely ask your module leader, if you're not aware of your university's policy, will the students see these? How much should I be writing on here? Ask them before you start. That's really useful, Annika. Thank you.
And Chris, can I chime in on the comments? If you're marking online exams, it can be very useful to just have a file open, like a text file on the side, because you will find yourself typing again and again the same comments. So if you have a file open with typical comments, and then you can do some copying and pasting, of course, always being careful that it actually applies to your to the particular script. That's super useful, and that can often also then be used for sort of a summary feedback document at the end for the group. That could be quite useful. And I know here in Manchester we are asking colleagues to provide sort of a group feedback document.
Yeah, great. So this is what Ralph's talking about. You'd have some maybe key sort of comments that might apply to someone, and then you could just simply copy and paste these onto your files if it was an online exam. Thanks, Ralph. That's great. Finally, I'll just say on this marking process, then if you're marking a technical question, often it's less necessary to put any comments because the answers are a lot more black and white, clear cut, and so it's easier for somebody who's checking this or a student who has the answers to say, well, I got that wrong, I got that right. So I'd write less comments on that, but sometimes I'd write a few bits as needed, or I'd highlight the specific error if that was more appropriate. Okay, final section on this part would be how much to check. Somewhere along the line, this checking needs to be done. Why do we check so much? Well, if a student goes home, sees the script, or finds out there's an error somewhere, then you can really lose the trust of the whole cohort, not just for your exam, but maybe their whole degree. They start to not trust the system. So it's really important. That can be really catastrophic if that happens. So it's really important to avoid that. So somewhere along the line, we need to check our marking carefully, and specifically, even just the numbers, without even talking about actually checking the sort of quality of marking, we need to check the following. So we need to check that all those sub-question marks, 1A, 1B, 1C, do they add up to the total for question 1 in the correct way? Do the question marks correspond correctly to the question marks on the front of the script? On the front of the script, do those marks correspond to the marking spreadsheet correctly? And then finally, does the total exam mark that you might work out from your spreadsheet, again, and put that onto the physical or online script overall, do those correspond correctly as well? That needs to be checked. Any simple arithmetic error is going to mess things up entirely, as I said. So that needs to be checked. So it's important where you should find out when that needs to be done. It may be that you're expected to do that for your batch of scripts, or on the other side, it might be that a module leader just gathers them all in and then checks them all themselves at the very end of the process, and you're not involved in this at all. But again, it's important to ask, when is that going to happen? Who's doing that? Is it my responsibility, or is it your responsibility? This stage is actually quite better to do in a social way. So if you can do that with a partner, that is really a lot quicker and a lot more fun. So if you have one person with the scripts, one person with the spreadsheet, you can check things and then shout them out. Does it correspond to the spreadsheet? Shout them out, and it's very quick and much more fun. So try and find a partner to do that with, or somebody at home in your flat or whatever. I'd recommend that. That's a lot quicker. Okay, Annika, I'm going to hand over to you. Annika's going to tell us more about how to mark productively, and then after that, we'll come back for all your questions and thoughts for the whole session. Thank you. Over to you, Annika.
Thank you, Chris. Okay, so I'm going to layer a bit of advice on top of the excellent process Chris has just laid out there. So productive marking. So here's some different approaches you can use with your marking, and I promise you I have used them all, but some of them work better than others. So this has happened to me, and I don't suggest doing it. Maybe also for just, you know, legal reasons. I should stress this was not at Bristol. Okay, so the approach I would not recommend using. You're given a period to mark. If you're lucky, it might be a couple of weeks. If you're unlucky, it might be a bit shorter, but you're given some kind of period to mark. And what happens is you get the scripts, you have a big pile, often stacked next to my desk, and I have other things to do. So then I leave them to mature in a locked filing cabinet for about 2 weeks. It's important it's a locked filing cabinet. If you do get scripts, actual physical scripts, remember they have to stay secure. So if you're in a shared office or an office that can be open access, I'm joking here, but you know, it's really important that actually real scripts are kept securely. So I left them for a couple of weeks, and then I completely ran out of time, didn't sleep, and had to do a lot of marking in a very short space of time. This, quite frankly, is a bad way to do it. It's incredibly stressful and will leave you end up feeling a lot like this. As much as it's not good for me, wasn't good for me, wouldn't be good for you, it's also bad because this is going to lead to all those inconsistent marking things we spoke about earlier. You're going to have less good outcomes on the module. You might need, as in less consistent outcomes on the module, and you're going to need to possibly remark, and the whole process gets quite bad. So how would I actually suggest doing it? How do I try and do it these days? So approach 2, still a 14-day time period here. The first thing I do is I get the scripts in. And if they are physical paper scripts, count them, okay? Because you want to make sure that the number of scripts you've just signed for in the office where you pick them up matches the number you've actually been given. You don't want it to be your responsibility at the end if there was some missing in the first place. So with physical scripts, make sure you count them in before you start. Make sure you also do the benchmarking process before you start any of the marking. Okay. Then it's typically going to look like this, right? So set yourself a reasonable goal. At the start, you will be slower. Set yourself lower targets at the start and mark some. At this point, maybe also do that early moderation bit, the interim moderation. Check with the other people on the unit. Are you still being consistent over your first 10 scripts or so? As you progress, once that's done, you'll be able to mark more per day. Okay, so do set differential targets depending on where you are in the process, and you will get faster. If you have a lot and you have the time, don't forget to add a rest day in the middle. Okay, you don't have to, you know, things like daylight are important. You can't just lock yourself in a room and do marking forever. The healthier kind of mindset you have, the better and more consistent your marking will be. So then come back and continue to mark in these manageable batches, often until it's done. So make sure you don't have one period where you're marking lots and lots and lots. Okay. Then at the end of that, you'll be able to return your scripts, smile, relax, and do whatever else it is you need to do alongside your marking. Okay. So I guess really the key here is planning. Okay, so make sure you plan, because then you don't feel stressed. Then you have this feeling at the end of your marking and you have an excellent summer. Okay. Okay. So how do we achieve that? So I've tried to think through the sorts of different things I would do if I have a marking session. And the setup really begins with just setting up your space and everything you need to mark. You obviously need the scripts, you need the mark scheme, you need the marking record sheets that Chris spoke about earlier. I also, if I'm marking actual scripts or online scripts actually, I like to just have a notebook next to me where I can jot down queries. I don't want to, every time I come up with a query, stop and then go off and try and find the answer, because then I never get into a point where I actually am marking whole scripts and get started. So I like to have a notebook just to get rid of, you know, any thoughts that come. I can park them there and come back to them later. I'm a terrible procrastinator and very easily distracted, so I do like to turn off any unnecessary apps. I will put my phone on the other side of the room at extreme points, even put it in a colleague's office. I need my headphones. I like to mark with a bit of music. I reckon Ralf can give us a good playlist. Have you got a favourite marking track, Ralf?
Changes by marking season.
Okay.
So,
I'm sure there's plenty out there on Spotify, etc.
depend. But I need something. I need actually usually like Cat Empire is a personal favorite of mine.
Very good. I also, to help measure what I'm doing, I like to sometimes have a clock or a timer around to make sure I'm not spending too long on any individual one. Particularly with essays. You know, I think with essays, I can start reading it like I'm reading some sort of referee report, and I can spend a long time getting in there. So sometimes it helps me to know that what I'm expected to spend per script is about 10 minutes. So I'm not going to spend more than that time. So clocks just help me moderate that. Having water snacks around also means I'm less likely to wander off and stop marking in the middle. I like to do it in a quiet space, and I like to kind of have a plan as to what I'm going to do rather than just staring at the scripts. During this idea of the flow state, I think is really, really important. You just need to kind of get in the groove and just start doing it. And as you come faster, this will become easier and easier. I do give myself a target per day, but also like a target per session. So like if I'm going to sit down for an hour, I'll be like, I'm going to mark 5 in this hour. That helps me stop looking at the big stack of scripts to be marked and losing all hope. Put those notes onto the notebook. Yeah, okay. So for paper exams, I often do like to mark per question, but that means I've got to be really strict about keeping the script in order. So I have like an in pile on this side and an out pile on this side. Particularly if you're marking hundreds of exams, you never want to get to the point where you have to reorganize all the scripts you've already neatly organized. It's very time consuming and quite distressing. So I try and keep a very strict order on how I'm going. As Ralf said earlier, if I'm doing online exams, I will copy and paste things and resist any desire to respond to the Teams ping that comes through. And I said use a timer if it's not working. At the end of a marking session, so at the end of like an hour or so, I would write a note to myself about what to do next time. So for example, Chris mentioned earlier, you can do this kind of hybrid of marking by question or by script. So often when I start, I'll just pick 10 scripts and I'm going to mark all the question 1s from those 10 scripts and then all the question 2s. And that might be all I've got done by the end of that hour. So then I would have sort of these different stacks. So I'd have a post-it note on each stack explaining to me what it is. And it'll be like, this stack, start from question 3. It is important to do marking sessions, not all at once. Do take those breaks, do stretch, do get daylight and reconnect with the world. There are points at which marking can also get quite frustrating, particularly if they're students you've been teaching and you know you taught them that thing in week 2 and then every week since, and why on earth didn't they get it right in the exam? But it's important not to let those stresses and frustrations come through into the marking. So do feel free to, as you would normally share frustrations with colleagues. It's a shared experience we all go through at this time of year. But remember to keep it super professional. This is students' work. Don't take pictures of that funny regression line you once saw. I always remember when somebody drew a regression line and it was like this snail spiral. It was very interesting. I've never seen one like it before. But don't get to the point where you're taking photos and posting it on social media or anything like that. Just remember, keep it super professional as you go along. I think that's me. Who's up next?
Yeah, that's me. Can I just, Annika, add one more? In Manchester, we do mainly online marking for the time being, and one little tool I found very useful. Like I can be terribly distracted if there's a browser open. I, checked the news 5 minutes ago, but perhaps something new has come up, and check up. I found very useful little apps or extensions you can get for your browsers. Like I use Chrome mainly, and it's one called Strict Workflow, where basically you click a button and it actually, I anyway have to share my screen now because
Yeah, go for it.
it's my turn. And you go, yeah, that's not. I was just looking that up. I have up here, perhaps you can see there's, can you see my screen?
You're not sharing it, Ralf?
I'm not sharing it. Okay,
Oh,
hang on.
sorry.
I'm here. I have, like in my Google browser, there's this green tomato here. And once I press that, I basically close down, it's sort of customizable, but all sorts of websites. Yeah, so I won't be able to go to the BBC or to the Guardian or whatever anymore. You can say, hey, my Blackboard site should stay open because that's what I'm working in, but everything else is closed. And I found at certain times I just need that for myself. Because I know I get too distracted, and other browsers have different versions of this.
I use a little app on my phone called Forest as well, which wouldn't restrict that, but it does stop me picking up my phone. And the advantage of that one is if you do enough of it, they'll plant a real tree.
There you go. Okay, so there's even, you can make it really pay off to not be distracted. So, hey, now I know we have some lecturers here, and my next section will not apply to lecturers, but many of you are teaching assistants who get paid specifically for the marking, or you're not an employee, that you don't have a fixed salary. Okay, so and I know different universities, there are different models. Some universities you get sort of paid by script. At other universities you get paid by time. In Manchester, we pay you for time. And what is important here is that you stay here. It's important here that before you start your marking process, it's again about expectations. It is very clear to you, but also to your course director or course convener, how much you've been paid for, either for how many scripts or for how much time. And there has to be a shared understanding of that. And everything else will result in very unhappy people. Most likely everyone will turn up to be unhappy. So that has to be clear. Now, there should also perhaps be an understanding, especially if you're being paid by time, how long your course convener expects you to take for one script, such that you have an idea of, how many scripts does that translate to? Because in the end, your course director or course convener will give you a bunch of script, okay? You saw it in Annika's slide, a big pile of script. And it should be clear that, if he says that you should be marking 4 scripts in an hour, that your pay is appropriate for the amount of scripts you're being given. Right? So that is super important, that you're clear about that right from the start. Then, of course, this is the idea, this is the plan. Now we know plans are there to be tossed into the bin, because marking always takes different. You may realize some questions are actually really super quick to mark and you're going quicker. In Manchester, we will never ask you to pay back any money, but I don't know how it is, but I suspect you'll never be asked to pay back any money if you can do a good job quicker than anticipated. But perhaps the bigger issue is that sometimes things just are slower. Okay, and that perhaps you realize that, hey, it's just not quite working out with the time budget I'm given. Now, I think the most important thing here is that you talk to the person, first to your course convener, and then perhaps also to the person who's responsible for your pay. Right? If the course, and then together with your course convener, you'll sort of need to try and figure out, okay, why is it taking me so long? Perhaps it's taking you longer because the guidance you've been given by the course convener could be better, could be more helpful. Okay, so once you recognize why perhaps it's taking longer, or perhaps you just misestimate that perhaps the course director marked 10 papers with 20 years of experience. It took him 15 minutes per script, and anticipated that it will take you 15 minutes as well, but of course it will take you longer. Right? Perhaps it's just some miscalculation. You just have to be honest to each other and say, hey, I cannot do the work in this time. So what I cannot tell you here is what then should exactly happen. That you have to sort out with your course director and the people who are responsible for your pay. It could be that you're being paid more. It could be that you have a smaller bunch of scripts to grade. It could be that your course director for the remaining scripts gives you better guidance. Okay, whatever the solution is, but don't wait until everything is over and say you've been paid for 20 hours of marking. You actually mark 40 hours and then you deliver the scripts back and say, hey, I marked for double the time. Can you pay me more? Your course convener may not be the person deciding this. So you need to, as soon as you realize there's an issue, please sort of raise it. And, you know, Chris told you earlier, sort of the spreadsheet, it's just very nice. If at the end of the first day, say you marked for 6 hours, and you can immediately see from the spreadsheet how many you marked, and then just, you know, do as Annika said, you will get a little bit faster. So you should expect to become faster, but you will be able to see after the first day whether the pay you've been anticipated, whether that is, you know, realistic in any way. So, Annika, that's your section again, right?
Yeah, sorry, me again.
Yeah. I'll pass you back to Annika, because many of you already, or some of you already in the Padlet indicated that you're wondering about how to deal with potential academic malpractice, say from large language models. So Annika will talk to you about this a little bit.
Is my screen sharing? I hope so. Okay. So there's all sorts of different problems we might encounter, including things about cheatering, or issues to do with AI. And, you know, in recent years, we've had issues with marking and assessment boycotts as well. So there's always an interesting curveball thrown into the marking period. And we kind of have to be ready to roll with them a little bit. Now, this is hard to say much about in detail, because every institution may have a very different situation and a very different set of guidelines and a very different set of responses. But as a general overview of things that are going on, let me kick off with plagiarism and poor academic practice, which is the fancy way of saying cheating. I mean, first of all, let's keep focus here. We're talking about you as a marker on a unit. Okay, so it is not your job, once you get to the marking stage of a unit, to suddenly be setting university policy or anything like that. So there might be things that you notice as you go through, but really what you do about it is always going to be determined by what your institution's policy. Okay, so what sort of signs might you notice? I mean, cheating can be very hard to spot, but sometimes there are just things that set off a bit of a red flag that you have to deal with.
I think maybe I'll send them my certificate.
Oh, could you mind meeting, please? Okay. So things you might pick up. So if you're marking online, you might pick up things in Turnitin, for example. You might have high similarity scores or high AI scores. So that might look a little bit like this. So this is from one of my assignments. If you use something like Turnitin, I get this number, which gives me a similarity score, meaning just a percentage of match to text to other sources. And then I get an AI readout as well that tells me something about the likelihood of being generated by AI. So there's something to bear in mind about both of these, and that is, first of all, that these are only indications, right? This is not proof. You have to kind of introduce a bit of a human element to decide what to do with it. So with the similarity ones, you know, high similarity scores can just be generated by things like people asked for a cover sheet to be included and all the cover sheets are the same. Or maybe Turnitin hasn't correctly recognize that the reference list is in fact a reference list and things like this. So the first thing to do is to take a look at it, look at what the similarity is, and see if you think there's actually an issue. You can see here in this assessment, what it's picked up as being similar is that this person has included the question. Obviously, that's not cheating. So have a quick look through it. Similarly with AI, you know, just because something has a high AI score may or may not mean anything, right? So there's this great article talking about what happens when you feed the US Constitution into ChatGPT and then run a similarity score. Sorry, when you run the US Constitution into a AI detector for things like ChatGPT, and it comes up saying that there's a very high probability that the US Constitution was written by AI. I'm no big history buff, but I don't think that's possible. And, you know, it's to do with the way the similarities works. It's to do with the way large language models construct things that can give this higher score. So this is just a really big warning. Don't be led by the numbers. Just have a look at it yourself and sense check it. If you really think there is a problem, then that's when you need to go back and start following whatever the procedure is. If you don't know what the procedure is, then this should be something you establish during the benchmarking process. What happens? So, for example, on my units, what I do is, because I sometimes have very, very large numbers of scripts, I actually give people access to a Word file or an Excel file, and I say, if you've got any concerns about scripts, can you put the script number and your concern in there, and I will collect them together at the end and deal with them as one group. That works with my institution's policies. Others might need reporting earlier or something. So just check, at least during the benchmarking process, what should you do if something comes up? It's not just auto-generated scores. You might also just use your head. Sometimes they clumsily copy things. You know, I'm the ChatGPT bot and I think this appears in the middle of it. You see repetition of phrases from the question that don't actually go anywhere. You get 2 or more scripts with identical errors. I have to be honest, I've had this and it was nothing to do with AI. This was just to do with 2 people copying each other. The task doesn't quite match the set of answers. There's just things that might not be quite right. It may very well not be right. Talk to your module lead about how to deal with it. Is it a case of poor academic practice, or is it a case of a lower mark classification? But whatever you do, don't let it completely throw you off all your marking. Make a note of it, come back later to it and deal with it at the end of your hour or 2-hour marking session. Okay. That's kind of the detail on AI that we can go into, but in a way, similar things apply to if you're hit by something like a marking and assessment boycott. Know the school's policies on what's going on. If you're unsure, speak to the people in charge, speak to your module leader and beyond, and go with that. I think that's kind of the most general advice I can give. But remember, if you're talking about marking and feedback, this isn't the point at which to start designing new policies. You just go with what the policy is. Does that make sense? Okay. I think this is... Go for it, Chris.
Sorry, Annika, I was just a second too soon there. So I think that's all we want to say from us. We've got plenty of time, which is great. Now to hear from you. We can go back to the Padlet to see if anyone has got any issues there. One that I spotted was thinking about AI, not from an issue of student misconduct or anything, but actually using our AI ourselves to help write feedback and things like that. So maybe that's one we can be thinking about. But while we're doing that, please gather your thoughts together, put a question in the chat. I'm going to take this question about using AI for our feedback. So I guess the idea is here that especially on online exams, and especially where the student's going to see those comments, then there's a lot of thought at the moment about how AI can make our jobs quicker as academics, and maybe we're tempted to use AI to expand. Maybe so we put some bullet points in about, oh, this was not the definitions weren't very good or whatever, and AI turns it into a beautiful, polite kind of discourse about that. I personally would find that a little bit worrying, without authorization from your university to do that. But I'm going to hand over to our AI specialist, Annika, see what she says.
No, I think you landed on exactly the right thing at the end there. When you're using AI tools, you have to be very careful about the data protection of the information you're feeding into the model and understanding how that's used. So I do know people who've kind of constructed their own sort of simple things and used it with a closed system. But you kind of need to be very clear with your institution that you're completely convinced that the data protection in the GDPR, for example, is compliant. So I'm not sure this is something I would initiate as a marker as part of a wider module. If you have your own module and you're looking at these tools, I would suggest this is something to build into the beginning of your module design and start having the conversations with your school at the beginning of the year so that they understand all the implications of what you're going to be doing. That being said, I've seen some really cool stuff. I've seen particularly people who quite cleverly use sort of tick boxes of kind of these are the things that are coming out, and then it spits out some personalized feedback at the end. Those kinds of things I've seen, and that doesn't necessarily involve giving the students work to any models. Whether you would do that as an individual marker, though.
Yeah. And Annika, I think that's indeed the key. I don't think you should be pasting in any student work into AI. Let's say you had to write feedback to an essay and you wrote all your feedback down in a Word document, and you want to find a better way to formulate that feedback. I wouldn't see a big problem if you felt that was, a ChatGPT could be delivering perhaps a nicer, friendlier way to deliver that feedback. If you're worried about that, I think that would be okay. But then you're not revealing any student work.
What another angle is, and I think this would be my Loughborough's take on it, would be actually, okay, I don't think there's anything, apart from Annika and Ralf's concern, maybe there's nothing wrong with it in our eyes. But if the press caught onto this and they took a sort of exaggerated it and said, "Oh, AI is marking your students' work," and you're leaving this in the hands of robots and things like this, which is obviously not true, but it could be taken that way, then my university would be very nervous about that. So definitely, you should not do this without authorization from your superiors. Good, great question. Thank you for that. There's a few in the chat. I'm going to delay and let's go to you over there. You've got your hand up there. Would you mind?
Just about the personalized feedback I was trying to say is you compose your own feedback for the work you graded, which is quite fine. And then a bit of maybe give it some kind of front that this is how we want the feedback to be recomposed, retailored, so that it will capture more in details how the students should address some of the issues you highlighted or some of the places where you commended the work. That in itself, it will come out clean that you have a kind of personalized feedback on the work. It's already your own idea, just that you want to use AI in recomposing the feedbacks. That way, it helps in making our works easier. I think
agree,
yeah.
And I think we'd all agree with that. But I think the risk is that the press would take a different interpretation of what we're doing.
Yeah, if you overdo it, of course, you have to strike a delicate balance there. Otherwise, it will seem obvious this is AI written, and that's where troubles will come.
At this current stage, I think it's highly contentious at the moment. Maybe in a year's time it will be fine, but I'd definitely get authorization before you do anything like that. Good, but great question, and thank you for contributing and having the confidence to speak. That's really helpful. Thank you.
Chris, can I pick up on Ekaterina's question in the chat? Ekaterina, perhaps you can unmute yourself so we can have a little chat, and I understand. So your marking and your course director asked you to provide feedback in a particular cell for each student in a spreadsheet. Is that the problem you're facing?
Yes. So we're using a similar spreadsheet in Excel to what you showed in the beginning. But then it's also helpful for the modules to see some comments either separately for the questions or for overall how the students did, and I just find that it takes longer than the marking itself to add all those comments.
That's true. Writing feedback often takes longer than just deciding what the grade should be, but that's fine, especially if your students can see the script, because then, you know, we usually think of exams at summative assessment, i.e. we are just assessing someone's learning, but especially if they're year 1 and year 2 students, and students see the scripts, they can also still learn from that, even for their next year, and feedback can be very useful. So that's just the nature of the game, that writing the feedback can often take more time, but you want to indeed find ways to do that as efficiently as possible. And I totally sympathize with you that writing text in Excel is just quite a chore. Now, if it was, you remember, Excel can easily import comma-separated value files, right? So you can just use a text editor and write in a text editor any text, and quite easily import that into Excel. So that may be a, you know, one way to perhaps just write it in the text editor and then import it and copy it into cells. I don't have any other amazing.
I used to have one university where I had to do this, and I also ended up in that situation where you just end up writing the same comment again and again in slightly different ways. So I think this is okay. So I'd write like 20 comments and I just number them, and then I just put the numbers in Excel. So I'd be like, this script is 245 or 16.2, and that's how I would do it, because I found it much quicker and more efficient, and I think provides the same information. If anything, more information, because you can easily aggregate the numbers. But
that's right. If it's just for the information of the convener, that is brilliant, because it provides this distribution. But if this is to also go to the students, you have to think about how to translate the numbers back into text, which can be done easily, you know. But
then we might be back into the AI conversation. Yeah.
And thank you very much, both. I like the tricks with the text editor and the numbers as well. I think that can be helpful. Yeah. That's really cool.
There's another question by Mila. You asked what, you know, if I see, actually, Annika, you described the situation. You had 2 scripts with the same mistake, which you think is possibly unlikely that the 2 students independently from each other found the same mistake. What did you do? Do you remember?
I did. I thought about it for far too long. That was the first mistake I made. I did. I looked at it. There was one sentence that triggered me, first of all, because I thought, hang on, this is a really weird thing I've not seen anywhere else except that one other script I just did. And so I started with that single sentence, and then I looked out and actually realized that the paragraph structure was very similar. There were more of these sentences that were very, very similar, using, you know, the same words in the same incorrect way. So in my school, we have an academic who's in charge of plagiarism and academic integrity. And so in the first instance, I spoke to them and I said, what should I do with this? I should point out that at this point I was the module lead, so I couldn't go and ask the module lead because it was me. And they said, yeah, this looks like it needs to go through the plagiarism academic integrity check. So I passed it all over to them. And in that sense, it was very easy for me to do. And then the school had processes that kicked in. And I mean, what happens in this case is they convene a small panel. I had to go as the module lead and just say, this is what I thought. The students have a right of reply. And then they can also bring somebody with them. And then something's concluded. And it can either be anything from, you know, a deduction of a few marks to having to repeat the piece of work, or for much more serious or repeat offences into the university kind of processes of removing students and things like that. So I think I felt, first of all, I should say I did feel a little bit intimidated, because reporting a student for just a suspicion is quite a big thing. But they had done it. And I also have a responsibility to all the other students on the course who have engaged with it honestly, to allow the integrity of their marks to remain. So that was the process I went through. It's not particularly enjoyable, but it also wasn't that time consuming. I just followed what the school said to do.
That's
Also,
right. Chris, you go.
sorry, I was just going to stress a lot of people who mark physical scripts, the temptation is to turn off here, but it isn't wholly out of the question for copying like this with in-person exams as well, especially where maybe there are some reasons in exceptional cases where somebody is sitting an exam in a foreign country or on a sports team tour or something where cheating might be more possible than the example. So just because you're using physical scripts, don't turn off completely. If there are identical scripts, you know, it can happen. So keep an eye out for that. Great. These are really excellent questions. Well done. Milad, we've got another one here. So what happens in the case where a student just produces the right answer without any working or steps, what to do here? And again, I think this might depend a little bit on whether you're in person or online. But I wonder if, Ralf, you've got any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think that something like this should come up in the benchmarking. So it's a really good question. I know we typically, when we ask sort of more quantitative questions in Manchester, we have something at the beginning of the exam which says, well, you know, we expect students to show, you know, full record of, you know, of their workings, and sort of explain the results. And that would give us sort of the license to certainly not give 100% of the marks just for the right answer. How much you want to give, if you want to give anything for just the right answer, this is really something you have to agree with your course director with. We can't give a generic answer here that will be valid every time, but it's a sensible question to ask when you do this benchmarking process.
And I think that that 20% level would depend on in person or not. So in person, you've got the right answer. You know, I'd be a lot more generous. Maybe half marks, let's say, rather than 20%. Out offline, you know, online, you're right. You could be a lot stricter on that. Okay. Any more questions? We've got 5 minutes or so.
Chris, can I pick up on one more from the Padlet, please?
Yes, please.
We sort of talked about this, but there was this one comment: how do I avoid marking too harshly? We already talked about sort of getting you know, the benchmarking hopefully gives us the right level. But I sometimes find myself becoming frustrated with, you know, Annika hinted at this, you know, that you sometimes say, wow, do students not get it? And the more this goes on, the 10th person who sort of doesn't write the right thing, I sometimes in hindsight think, oh, have I been a little bit too harsh on that? So the two things I can recommend you do: A, take a break. As you know, that Annika said, think about sort of blocks of perhaps 1 hour, give yourself a little break. But if that moment comes after half hour, then take a break after half an hour and eat an apple, drink a cup of tea and listen to a song and come back. The other thing you may occasionally want to do is just go back to papers you have already marked to, you know, to compare what I've done, especially when you have a spreadsheet. Then you can say, okay, is there someone who did equally badly from the grades or did fairly badly in the grades in that question? You can go back to that question and see what grade you gave, perhaps what comment you gave, and that can sort of help you to perhaps get on a level field again. You don't want to do that all the time, okay? But if you catch yourself feeling slightly grumpy, that can help you.
The other thing I sometimes do, Ralf, as well, is if I hit a particularly difficult one, I just don't know what to do with it, I will skip it and come back to it later. I often stick a big like neon post-it note on it if it's a physical one, and just like, I'll come back to it. That can sometimes work.
On the flip side of all of this, if you're as neurotic as me, you can end up in a cycle of checking everything and then thinking about, oh my, and then going backwards and forth. Yeah. So at some point, checking is good, but at some point, you've just got to back yourself or seek help from your module leader. You know, otherwise you're just going to go in this complete cycle of emotions, especially when you're a new starter. So don't do too much of that without help, anyway.
No, that's right. And actually, one thing, it took me a long time to accept for myself that I cannot be perfect when I mark. To a certain extent, you just have to accept that you will be inconsistent to a certain degree. And you can't expect for yourself that if you mark 200 scripts or more, that you are totally consistent. So I have accepted, took me a while, that this is an imperfect process, which led me in turn to the approach that if I have to mark a question and I have to say, oh, is this, should I give this 4 or 5 points here? If I'm in this situation where I'm sort of doubting, I give the higher mark, because I know there is uncertainty in my marking process. So in doubt, let's be generous. That's of course that cannot lead to sort of the overall great distribution, mushrooming out, but it's sort of for me, since I accepted that, I feel sort of much better about that, and I less often get stuck into sort of cycling through.
So I was just going to do a quick, there's lots of frustrations we've spoken about today, and lots of, how difficult this period of the year can be and frustrating. But I just think for anyone who's thinking about, teaching over the long term, I think it's important to remember there are some good things you can get out of marking. As I have increasingly tried to depersonalize it and realize that, my students aren't writing bad answers just because they hate me. Students are actually trying their best. There's a lot I can learn from marking about what went well in my teaching and what I might want to change next year. And I think sometimes I find it helpful to just kind of rephrase marking as a kind of like, it's closing the feedback loop, right? It's telling me what I might want to look at more in the future, or think about, teach differently. And if you enjoy teaching at all, then that can also be a good thing. There are good things we can get from marking. That's my message.
Thank you for all the excellent, thoughtful questions we've had today. Thank you for participating with us. We will wish you all the best with your marking, if you're already started or you're about to. And thank you on behalf of the Economics Network and everyone here. Thank you for joining us today. Hope to see you again. If you look at the chat as well, there's lots of other events and resources with the Economics Network website, so do check that out for the future. Thanks everyone, been fun. Thank you very much.
Thank you everyone. Bye-bye.